I would like to introduce our keynote speaker of the day, Professor Dan Ariely. I've been really looking forward to this. Now, for all the behavioural science geeks in the audience, Dan probably doesn't need introducing, but he is Professor of Psychology and Behavioural Economics at Duke University and is best known for his work on irrationality and his many best-selling books, including Predictably Irrational and The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, and of course some very, very popular TED Talks along the way. Now, I interviewed Dan a few years ago for the BBC, and I've been putting into practice some advice he gave me during that interview, which was never to pay a friend for a favour. And that the moment you bring money into a situation like that, when a favour's happening, then it starts to monetize it, it starts to change their thinking, and they start to think, well, you know, is this a good deal for changing your tyre for you? Perhaps it's not, perhaps you should be paying more. I could earn more money doing something else. And his advice was instead to give a gift afterwards. Now, it's a win-win, because actually the gift is usually, they like it better, and the gift is usually cheaper than the amount of money you would have paid. So that is one tip. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what tips he might have for us today. We're very excited because he's going to talk about some of his more recent work, which you may not have heard about. So please welcome me in joining Dan Ariely.
Thanks a lot, and good morning. Before I start, you might have noticed that I have half a beard. You might have wondered why I didn't wake up late or lose a bet. Many years ago, I was badly burned, so most of my body is covered with scars, including the right side of my face, hence the half beard. I say it in the beginning because somebody told me that unless I say what this half a beard is from, people continuously think about why is this half a beard and don't focus on the talk. So now we've covered facial hair. We can move on. In general, in life, I have two hats. I'm part of a group at the university at Duke called the Center for Advanced Hindsight. Good name. And we mostly study financial decision-making and health. I'm also part of a group called Kaima in Israel that works exclusively with the Israeli government. And today I want to say kind of two general things. I want to tell you a little bit about our process of working, how we think about it, and then I want to give you examples from our work with the Israeli government that would illustrate different parts of this process. So, you know, we're all here for the same reason. We want to think about how we use principles from social science, behavioral economics to design the world, right? I mean, we want to understand why people do what they do, but the ultimate goal is to change behavior. And why do we care about this? Because if we look at the world, we can't look at it and be happy, right? And that's one of the things I think that is so unique to behavioral economics is in standard economics, you look at the world and you say, that's the outcome of about 8 billion rational people. That's what we can achieve. In behavioral economics, we say, no, the world can be much better. In fact, this is the outcome of 8 billion irrational people making mistakes all the time, and we can do so much better. And if you think about this gap, the gap between where we are and where we could have been, it's very sad because we have things like we misuse our time and we misuse our money and we waste our health and we have hate and we don't have enough motivation in all kinds of things. We waste the environment. There's all kinds of really, really sad things. The good news is we can make progress, right? So I choose to look at the glass half full. There's lots of room for improvement, and we have the tools to try and think about how we reduce this gap between what we have and where we could be. Now, when most people think about this challenge, including many people in governments, the usual answer is, let's just give people information, right? If people are not doing the right thing, let's just tell them, right? And people would immediately change. But the sad reality is that giving people information almost never works. And you can just think some examples like medication adherence, we know information doesn't work. Exercise, we know doesn't work. I mean, just think about yourself for a second. How many people here in this room have not exercised enough in the last month? Smoking, of course, is one of those cases. How many people here in this room in the last month have eaten too much? Okay, just a few more examples. How many people in this room in the last month have at least once texted while driving? Okay, so we have an honesty gap here. Let's try a couple of more. How many people here in the last month have not always washed your hands when you left the bathroom? Give you one last chance for honesty. How many people here have ever, not just the last month, have had unplanned, unprotected sex? One proud person. The point is that for lots of things, we know that information doesn't work, right? And we've tried it over and over and over, and it's usually a good thing to try at some point. The challenge is that in many cases, it's the only thing that we try, and we're yet to discover places where purely giving people information really works. So if not information, then what? So I want to kind of present to you a very, very simple model of behavioral change. It's a model that we all kind of use in some way. And I think about it as friction and fuel. We take a particular behavior, and the first step we're looking at is to say, what can we take away? What is there about this process that is unneeded, that is holding people back? The apples are a little too far away. The drawer in the refrigerator that holds fresh fruit and vegetables is a little too far and opaque, hard to reach. All kinds of little things that are in the way. And then the second part, which is much more complex, by the way, is to say, how do we add motivation? Right? We have a particular behavior. The behavior is about some long-term benefit. Right now, it's not that exciting. What kind of motivation we can add? Think about it like cooking, where you say, what kind of spices can I add? It's a much more creative, complex process, and many times we have to add motivation that have nothing to do with a particular activity. We want kids to study, we add exams. It's not really the important thing, but we all of a sudden create a measurement tool, and we create some competition and create other incentives that are irrelevant to the true nature of what we want people to do, is to study, but we add it now. We want people to lose weight, and we add Weight Watchers, right? We add some competition and social embarrassment and other things like that. So that's the general model we'll start with, and let's start with friction, the things that are holding us back. In this particular case, so I'll give you one example. We try to get people to take less cash from ATM machines. Why? Cash has all kinds of negative things for society, including funding terrorism, but also not paying taxes. So it's a good thing to try and reduce the amount of cash. And we looked at the system, and the system has lots of places. There are ATMs themselves. There's money that you pay to small businesses that you might be tempted to pay with cash rather than to pay with electronic payment. And of course, there's things like credit cards and so on. So you have ATMs, you have receipts, you have credit cards, all of those things. We've done experiments on all of them. But right now, I'll tell you a little bit about one experiment on ATMs. And this is in Hebrew. This is not in Hebrew. But the experiment was done in Israel in Hebrew. And this is just a general description of how an ATM looks like. You go in, you put your card, you get lots of numbers, you get to pick one. And we tried lots of things. One thing we tried was to take all of those numbers and make them smaller. Not just a regular anchor when you have one number, but we said, what if the whole set of numbers was regular, whatever they have in the beginning, slightly lower or much lower? We also decided to pick a default. There's one button that has been pre-selected for you. Either 400 shekels, about $100, pounds or 250 shekels. We also tried other things, like we tried to frighten people. We said if people took over a certain amount, we said, just so you know, we're writing down your name and the numbers of these bills. And we'll keep it in our records until the bills show back up into the banking system. We didn't actually, we told them this. We didn't really track the numbers. You said ethical questions about experiments. Small scale experiment. We just wanted to see if it's worthwhile. And we also changed the fees, right? Right now, there's a fee. And if you think about the fee, if it's a fixed fee, it gives people an incentive to take a lot of money because it amortizes the fee, so you're getting less. So we said, what if the fee had different levels? It started with free or started with very small, and then it went up. So we tried lots of things. Here's the final answer. The winner had everything, right? The winner had default and anchoring, small amounts of money. We gave people the incentives and so on, and it reduced the amount of money people took from 630 shekels, right? It's about 4 to 1 for the pound, to 318. So we did a big gap, but what you can see is that just anchoring and making a small default of 250 got you all the way there, almost all the way there, right? How much of it was the financial incentives? Not that much. How much of it was the frightening message about keeping track of the numbers? Not that much. We could do a lot of the work just by changing the total numbers and picking a default. Of course, financial incentives work by themselves, but that was the first experiment. Very simple, right? Take the interface for the ATM, change multiple things, see what works. Now we're ready to roll it out. Okay. There are other things we've done. We've done prize invoices, right? So we gave people incentives to ask for an official receipt because they could submit that and get prizes. Lots of things to say about that. We also created a system where small businesses have a reputation that they can keep, maintain, and increase if they use electronic transactions, and small businesses really wanted it. The idea was that as they accumulate their reputation, our version of the tax authority would be nicer to them if they ever found out that they make mistakes, so you get to build reputation. All of those things work. Okay, so that's part one, friction. Just think about what's the button, change the default, change the numbers showing on the screen, get people to think a little bit in a different way, change the financial incentives, all of those work. Fuel, motivation. This is a kind of an experiment that a lot of us in this room have been doing before. People set up appointments to go to see a physician or have some exam, and many of them don't show up. Some for good reasons, some for bad reasons. The bad reason is just not showing up. The good reason is that by the time people get to the appointment, sometimes they're healthy. So, then they shouldn't show up. But lots of people don't show up. Very bad for the system. And there was this system before we came up that gave people reminders. 5 days before, send one reminder. 3 days before, send another reminder. And the reminder was basically like very dry, saying, you have an appointment, please show up, or if you're not showing up, tell us that you're not going to show up. Not showing up is fine, right? If people just told us. We approached the system and changed lots of things. We had a request from a person, right? Rather than anonymous, we said there's a person wanting that. We said it's a national effort to try to reduce that. We said most people show up, social proof. We told them how much it would cost the medical system if they don't show up. We said it's important for their family that they show up. All kinds of things like that. A selection of things that we thought could work. The good news, we ran this on about 160,000 people. The good news was that almost everything was better than the standard system. By the way, when you do these things, sometimes you wonder, like, who designed that? right? It's so easy to do better. Like, did somebody actually put some thought into designing this, this prompt? I was actually very happy that the thing that worked the best was saying that there's another patient that could use your system. I don't know if this is unique to Israel or not, right? It's a question of solidarity in society and so on, what would work the best. But it was nice to find out that that was the message that worked the best. We saved with this message about 400,000 waiting days in the country. It's a small country, so if it was a big country, it would be more. And then we did something else. We said, look, we did an RCT. We sent everybody the same message, and we can find out. I mean, randomly. We took 8 groups. Everyone got their own message. That's a good thing. But we have lots of people. Can we start to analyze what kind of people react better to which messages? We have the statistical improvement, but which one? So we created a very complex AI model that basically took into account everything we knew about the people. What clinic was it? Which part of the country? How often have they been in that clinic before? Have they been people who have been not responding in general, like people who are kind of characteristically not showing up, or do they have a good reputation for doing that? And we said, what else can we squeeze from the data if we got a system that tailored for each person the message that would fit them specifically? And basically, we got a situation where we reduce no-show from 21% to about 14% with the standard message. I showed you somebody else could do it. And we could get another reduction to 12.5% if we did kind of an AI personalization. There's a couple of things here. One is that the vast majority of the work, everybody could get the same message, right? If you think about the big bulk of the improvement, it was from using one message. You could tweak a little bit more and get some other benefits, certainly worthwhile doing, why not? But sometimes we say, oh, if we could just do the AI exercise, we will get the best result. I think mostly it's like 80-20. We could get much, much better by getting the right message, and then we can tweak around the edges and get a bit more. No reason not to do it, but let's not put too much weight on just that approach. Okay, so that was friction and fuel. Let's change the default and so on, and then the fuel is let's add motivation. Let's remind you that it costs people money, that your family wants you to show up, that your physician wants you to show up, somebody else could use the time and the appointment, and let's see what motivates people to do something. However, and I have to say this was kind of a surprise for me as I left my regular lab research and started doing research in the field. Sometimes I'm realizing that we actually don't know where we're going. When we design an experiment and we think about friction and fuel, we need to know what the objective is. But the reality is that there are many questions that the Israeli government poses to us that we find out that we're not really sure what the question is and what direction we want to go. And then we need to take a step back and say, let's just collect data. Let's just start to understand what's really going on. And this is becoming a bigger part of our lives, trying to understand what's the setup, where are we trying to go. So in this case, we decided to look at transportation. Transportation, a huge problem around the world, as you know. And we try to kind of even figure out what is the landscape, what are the possibilities, what kind of things can we do. So we started by analyzing cellular data. We planted, anyway, let's not talk about this. We magically got data from almost every citizen in the country about where they live and where they work and how they drive to school, and do they stop in the way to take their kids to work, and do they have a bicycle and a dog and all kinds of things like that. How consistent are they in their commute? All kinds of things like that. And we started mapping. And in this particular case, we mapped one big industrial part, high-tech park, where lots of people come in and leave to work. And the first thing we mapped was the hours of the day and when was the peak. How did the distribution of arrival happen? And you know, traffic is a very nonlinear system, right? It's the last 10% is creating a tremendous amount of damage on the whole system. So of course you can see that 9 o'clock in the morning is a really terrible hour. If you could just shift people a little bit up or down, you could create a lot of benefit. We also looked at when people leave, slightly less concentrated, but not a good pattern either. We didn't settle for this. We also tried to figure out what are the types of vehicles, because we have cell phone data, so we don't know. But so we have cameras on the way in and out of that particular part, and we analyze what kind of transportation people have. Lots of private cars, very few buses, very few bicycles, and so on. We also looked at the purpose, why people show up. Mostly it was work commuting. Okay. Then we could look at things like, what's the distance from work? And we found that about 5% of the people live 1.5 kilometers away from work. That's not a lot of distance, right? If you could just convince those people. And if you look at 5 kilometers, it was 26%, right? This kind of data, by the way, was a big surprise. Like if you look at how governments in general, in this case not just Israel, plan transportation, it's usually a guy with a pencil and a map that draws where public transportation is. It's shocking how little data there is to do these things. But when you look at this data, you start to understand there's lots of benefit by understanding where people are. We also use some drones to try and figure out a bigger range and where there are challenges. You can see here the map and the junctions from all around. And we try to figure out how does the congestion happen on those. Is there a particular junction that is the cause to this? Is there something about traffic light that are causing the challenge? Analyze those drones, these images as well. And it is true that when you look at an area, a lot of time the congestion is happening outside of the area. It's just a ripple effect. Okay. Then the next thing we did was we tried to figure out per anonymous resident what are their potential of using public transportation, right? So we basically simulated and we say if those people, if each person that we have in our database wanted to take public transportation or bus or walking or taking a bicycle, what is their potential for doing this? And we mapped, in this case, only a small part of the country by saying what is the potential for current public transportation. And we saw that there's a lot of people who have this potential but are not doing it. Those are only people who are driving. And we wanted to see, do they have even a potential of using public transportation? By the way, public transportation in Israel is not so good, very much unlike London, for example. But even though it's not so good, we felt that there's a lot of potential for people to take it because, as you'll see, people's perception of how terrible it is, people perceive it to be much worse than it really is. Okay, so we have several data, we have drones, we have this public transportation fit analysis, and now it's time to figure out, can we do some experiments and move behavior? We felt that there's a potential, right? That was the first thing, can people even take public transportation? What is the potential? Now we can start doing experiments. So the first thing we did was we said, what's the high potential? The green dots I showed you before, and it turns out there's a huge potential for the green dots. There's a huge potential to take people who are currently driving a car to move to transportation. We also did, we simulated the following question. We said, imagine that we would approach people who are living next to each other and driving almost every day to the same place and coming back to the same place, that we did kind of a matching approach. what is the probability that we will find two people who live up to 1 kilometer away from each other, live to work and back 15 minutes apart from each other, and go to work and back at the same time? If we could do that from privacy perspective and so on, the potential is about 90% of the people. So about 90% of the people, we could find a match like this, which is quite incredible, but tells you these are solvable problems. We just need to get the data and start working on this. Okay, so there's a high potential for public transportation, biking or walking. There were 33% of the people that we felt with some effort could get there. But even if we could only take 16% of the cars out of the road, that's a lot. That's a lot. You can't recognize a system that takes 10% of the cars out. So we tried lots of things. We tried a system where we encourage businesses and individuals to work flexible hours, which means to stay at home one day and work from home, or leave a little later, come back earlier. Lots of advantages there. We tried what we call a personal commuting plan, which I'll tell you a bit more about, and then we tried some financial incentives. Personal commuting, we did it with one company, and we basically set, not we, but we got consultants to sit with each of the employees and create for them an opportunity map of what else they could do. And the question was, do people even know what are their alternatives? It turns out people had no idea what their alternatives are. We think people know, but they didn't. Most people got an idea of what they could do instead. And what we showed is that 63% of them have tried alternative commuting plans during the trial, during a few months of the trial. We also paid them during the trial. 38% of those kept on doing it 6 months after we ended the trial. Right? So we had a couple of months of a trial in which we incentivized people to use other paths. 38% of them kept on doing it for 6 months afterward, and 76 were either satisfied or very satisfied with their other options. So it does mean that there are other options. We just need to help people identify them. We also tried to pay people not to enter the city. And paying people not to enter the city in rush hour is an effective mechanism. And then we did another experiment on framing. So we tried to figure out what happens with loss aversion, what happens if we prepay people. And you can see this in yellow. Paying in advance works better than paying later. Lower numbers here are better on this graph. And we also compared framing. What happens if we give the money in cash? What happens if we give it for a saving plan for their kids, for college? And what happens if we just give them discounts on license fees for the car? It turns out the best approach was to give them discount on license fees for the car and paying in advance, saying if you don't do it, you'll have to give the money back. And with this approach, we could incentivize people in the best way not to use their cars. We're now working on other things like that, including congestion tax. Okay, so we talked about friction, fuel, and then that sometimes we just need to put a serious effort to understand what is actually going on before we can even propose any intervention. The next thing that we think about the process is to say, and then how do we scale, right? A lot of time we start with small experiments, but the reality is that if they end up being complex experiments that we can't scale, that's not our goal to change policy. So we try to figure out how do we scale, and specifically we are trying to figure out what do we do with technology to scale our solutions. In this particular project, we were trying to get more kids, particularly more young women, to study the things that would allow them to be scientists, and particularly computer scientists down the road. Every country wants more science technology. Israel is no exception. There's a big gender gap. We're trying to both fix the gender gap and increase the number in general. And we started with a survey that asked young women and young men why they're not studying computer science, the most standard answer we got was it's too difficult. And there was a big gap between what girls answered and what boys answered on that particular end. It makes sense that that might be the difference. Now, we'll come back to this. We then look at the process. Kids choose a major in high school, then they choose an academic degree, then they choose a career. The next part of intervention that we tried to catch was the place where people choose an academic degree. So there's an academic degree, you get to choose what you want to study at university, there's a website, you get to choose. We tried to intervene at that particular point with absolutely no success. Most likely because it was too late. Right? It's true that people came to the website to choose, but they probably chose before. They were not really choosing, they were just executing the choice. So we said, okay, let's go earlier. Let's try and attack it when people choose a major for high school. And actually, this was a nice story of failure. When we started, there's a lot of things like computer science light courses. I'm sure you have them in every country, where you say, oh, let's just give them a 3 or 6 week-long computer science light class, and at the end of it, everybody would want to be a computer scientist. And the very nice people from the government said, why don't you help us digitize this? So right now, it's very manpower intensive. Why don't you digitize that course so we can give it at scale to everybody? We said, fine, but let's first check that it works. So we took the best class we could find, and we did a before-after evaluation with a control group, people who studied neuroscience instead of computer science. And what do you think happened? Oh, actually, you can see it here on the slide. What happened was that it had no benefit for the boys, and it made the girls less likely to want to study computer science. And by the way, this is the thing that everybody does. Google, Microsoft, everybody does those classes. Right? Nobody bothered to ever evaluate them. But we also had such a strong intuition that it has to be wrong that we repeated the experiment. We repeated the experiment with the same results. Doesn't do anything for boys, make it less likely for girls. Now, this was a tough process because we didn't know even where to start to figure out why it doesn't work. But it took us a while, and then we figured out. We figured out at the end of those 3 to 6 weeks of computer science light, the girls knew that they could do it, but they thought it was unbelievably boring. Right? Because what happened in the first 3 to 6 weeks of computer science light is you learn how to move a turtle on the screen. And at the end of this, the girl said, yes, I can do it, but who wants to do it for a living? Like, you know what? What kind of work is this? The boys didn't mind too much. It was sufficiently... You know, it was just like another computer game. I think they were just not thinking about purpose and meaning and so on of what do we actually try to achieve. So anyway, so instead we did something else. We ran around the country and we filmed young people, but particularly young women who are doing computer science and something. Computer science and technology, computer science and design, computer science and health, computer science and education. And what we did was we created a website where the kids got to choose what they want to study in high school. Right? But through that website, they had to see these professions. And the idea was that the barrier here was not the barrier, I can't do it. The barrier was, what do I want to do? Anyway, we did this major selection website. We filmed a day in the life of all kinds of people, particularly young women. And we increased the number of people who, by about 20%, the number of particularly boys, but even more with girls, who chose to study things that could qualify them to be computer scientists down the line. I mean, there's still lots of ways, and there are many more intervention points that we need to go through. But as a starting point, it seems to be good. I want to mention one more part for our process, right? So we say figure out the data, friction, fuel, scale. Sometimes there are very complex trade-offs to make as social scientists. And the trade-offs are because we actually expand the scope of dimensionality of what are we thinking about as our objective. In this particular case, we're trying to increase tax compliance. And think about tax compliance. You can frighten people. You can tell them what the government is doing for them. You can try and get them to feel there's reciprocation. There's all kinds of ways to do it. And the thing about it is that we need to think about not just how do we get more taxes, which is a very proximal, simple measure, but we also have to think about what are the attitudes of the people that we're dealing with. What is their sense of what is their role in the country? So we're trying to, if you're trying to get people to use less cash, relatively simple. If you're trying to get people to pay taxes, you have to think about how do they think about themselves as citizens. If we just frighten them, and even if we get them to pay more taxes, is this the right objective function? So what we're trying to do now is to also think about expanding the scope, thinking about more dimensions of our interventions, and thinking about how do we trade them off. We're moving into more complex area, but that's what we're doing. And in this particular case, I told you we're trying to do things on tax evasion, and we're trying to think about well-being, trust of the government. We're trying to think about things like how people view their role in society. We're doing things like sending people pamphlets that tell them what the government does with their taxes. We're doing things that try to increase trust in the tax authority and measuring those other dimensions as well. And it actually creates a situation where there's no real right answer. At some point, you have to trade off goodwill toward the government versus more taxes. How do we make those decisions? But it's something that we need to enter to the discussion. And I think it's our role, because some of the other measures are very simple. Just more money? No. Let's think about some other dimensions and complex trade-offs. And finally, in many ways, we need to recognize that we need to keep on retesting things. The world of physics is rather simple. Physics has not changed for many, many years. You learn something in physics, it stays. For us, things change all the time. The world before Facebook is a different world than the world after Facebook. If right now text messages work better than sending people letters, it doesn't mean that it will stay like this, because it could be that it's a matter of attention. People spend more attention to text messages, less to letters. Maybe in 5 years, it would be different. If we think about what professions kids and particularly young women find meaningful, maybe that would change as well. So in our world, we need to, I think, worry very much about what are the kind of things that are going to change, and we need to realize that this is something we need to work on. And there's a fear, I think, that we give governments a solution, and governments will implement that solution and will not consider changing it down the line. And it's our job to think about under what conditions do we need to do continuous. But every few years to go back and change and make sure that we're on the right path. So this is our kind of general process. Discovery, sometimes we don't need it. Friction and fuel, I think we all need it. Scale, almost all the time. Trade-offs, expanding the scope, and then retest when needed. I do want to mention that friction is not always bad. Sometimes we just say, but for example, this is my email. I went to a conference and they asked me to put my email. I said, I really don't want to. And they said, you have to. So these are the first 100 and some characters from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Good sorting mechanism. if you think about what we've achieved over the last 300 years or so as humanity, we've achieved tremendous things, right? It's amazing. Look at this wonderful, wonderful room. We have lights, and we have air conditioning, and we have microphones, and we have seats. And on each of those things, we collectively have worked tremendously. Just think about a chair. It has arms and legs, and it has cushion. Just like even little things, like our bum is slightly sensitive, so we make the cushion exactly right. And you walk in London, and what an amazing city, what an amazing structure. And we have invested so much in the physical infrastructure of our lives. And I think it's because it's so easy for us to see we're not Superman. Right? So we have Superman, can fly, we can't. Right? We say, let's invent planes. And then Superman can run very fast, we can't, let's get cars. And Superman can sit for a long time, we can't, let's have a cushion. And, and everything that our fragile body is not able to do, we create technology to do it. And we kind of wrap ourselves with technology, and we didn't come with a perspective of saying, let's change humanity. Like, let's be cold resistant. No, let's build heaters, and let's get better clothes, and so on. Let's make ourselves, being able to run faster. No, not going to work. Let's get cars. And if you think about it, we've spent so much of our time and effort and so on improving, creating an infrastructure for our limited physical ability. What about our mind? Right? People have made lots of jokes about Brexit, but it's hard not to, right? You sit. You look at this amazing city, and you say almost everything that is physical has been done here in an amazing way. Public transportation, pedestrian crossing, the design of the light, cross and don't cross. Everything, like it's an amazing city. And then you look at the cognitive capacity to make decisions. And what are the tools? What are the tools for our minds? Right? What are the tools that we're making for our mind? And how important those are? And I think we have this thing where in the physical world, we see our limitations so clearly, it's very hard to avoid it. In the mind, I think it's much easier to keep the illusion that we're all knowing, all able, and capable, and we're not building the same tools. But those tools are just as important. And I'll give you one very simple example. Think about credit cards. What do credit cards as a tool for payment get us to do? There's something called the pain of paying. And the pain of paying is the idea that when we spend money, we feel differently depending on the payment method that we use. So imagine tonight you're going to dinner. Imagine it's going to be £100, and you're paying with cash or with credit card. Which one is going to feel worse? The cash, right? Why? Imagine that I own the restaurant, and I figure out that people on average eat 100 bites and pay £100. And I came to you and I said, because you're such a wonderful person, I'll give you a discount. It will be £0.50 per bite. And not only that, I'll only charge you for the bites you eat. The bites you don't eat, you don't need to pay. And I'll serve you your dish, I'll sit back, and every time you take a bite, I'll mark a little V on my notebook, and at the end of the meal, I'll charge you £0.50 for every bite you take, only for the bites you take. How much fun will that meal be? Not so much. Sometimes when I teach about the psychology of money, I bring pizza, and I charge the students 25 cents per bite. What do you think happens? Huge bites. And you might think, oh, the students would learn, right? They will take one big bite, they'll figure out it's not a good way to eat pizza. No, they don't. They sit there with the pizza, and they push just a little bit too much. At the end of the process, it's very cheap but very unpleasant. But the temptation is very important. Now, the pain of paying is this thing that says that if we pay and consume at the same time, something very different happens to our consumption. So what do we do with credit cards? Are they a good tool or not so good tool? Credit cards take away the pain of paying from us. Are we doing better? Not so much. So we compared what happens with credit cards to prepaid debit. Imagine that you want to spend, let's say, £1,000 a month on discretionary spending, restaurants, taxi, and so on. If it's on a credit card, people spend more. If it's on a prepaid debit card, people spend more in line with their budget. But we don't have to stop there. What do you think is better, to do £1,000 a month or £250 a week? Turns out a week is a better tool. Why? If you get £1,000 a month in the beginning, you say, wow, I'm rich. And people way overspend. If it's for a week, it's better. We see the horizon. We see the opportunity cost. And then what is better? Is it better to load the card with money on Monday or on Friday? Better on Monday. What happens when we load on Friday? The weekend. We end up overspending. If we load on Monday, we anticipate the weekend, we savor, we wait for it, and then on the weekend, if we overspend, we can more easily go up and down. So the point is that there's lots of things like that. You know, there's lots of things where we can take the analogy of doing things in the physical world for every small nuance, and we can think about what are the tools for the mind. How do we get people to be slightly healthier? How do we get people to manage their time slightly better? How do we get people to think more about the environment? How do we improve motivations? All of those are possible. We just need to start realizing the cognitive limitation alongside our physical limitations. The final point I want to make is something about the field. I think that a lot of what we've done, not exclusively, but a lot of what we've done are small tweaks. We take systems that people give us, a form, SMS, something like that, and we say, what are small things that we could do to improve it? And there's lots of great improvement to do. It's very interesting, it's academically satisfying, and it moves the needle. However, as I'm doing more and more with technology for transportation, for helping people making choices, for improving the engagement of civil servants, all kinds of things like that, I'm getting to realize more and more that we need to get into the design of tools. We can't just be given tools and say, let's do tweaks. We need to actually design the tool. And from that perspective, I have a call for action. And we at Kaima really want to design those tools. And if you're interested in joining us, what I'm envisioning is that people from all kinds of units can come. I'm hoping we will meet once a year. I hope that once a year we'll think together about what tools would we all collectively want to build, and then we'll build them. And I'm 5 seconds over, and thank you very much.
5 seconds over. That's very impressive indeed. You've set the bar high for the rest of the day there, right there, I must say. Thank you so much for that. You covered so much. I mean, an astonishing amount there. And an astonishing amount of new work. How many people do you have working in your lab, or do you never sleep?
Both. So at Duke, we're about 45 people, mostly working on applied projects, mostly with sponsors. And at Kaima, we're about 25, right. Half computer scientists, designers, half social scientists.
And it sounds as though, in a way, you're getting more and more ambitious with the scale of things that you're trying to do, from small tweaks in wording to much bigger things like, trying to get people to change the way they commute or change their working hours is big things. Are you impatient to make even bigger changes, like you were saying there? It sort of sounds like that.
So yes. But I'm also, I really gamble with my time. So I get lots of requests from all kinds of places, and I often try things, Often things fail, but sometimes they succeed, and I'm looking for a weak point in the system where somebody is willing to try something different. So I'll give you an example. In Israel, not too long ago, there was a budget that was giving people with disability a bigger budget. And I thought this is an opportunity, right? There's going to be a bigger budget. Let's figure out what's the right way to give this big budget. And there was a study about 2 explosions that happened, one in Belgium, one in Holland, about 10 years ago. And what the study showed was that the Dutch were fine and the Belgians were depressed, PTSD, not incorporated into the world. And when they looked into it, they were both big explosions with lots of people injured, burned. And what they found was that in Holland, it was a small community. So everybody knew that people were injured, and they just went back into the world. Whereas in Belgium, it happened in a train station. People basically went to their community. They didn't have the social support. And it turns out to be very important that, if I think about my own experiences being injured, you live your life, you're quite happy, and then you get injured, and life quality goes down deeply. And then at some point, you kind of manage to get slightly better. And then they say, now go out to the world. It's a deep reduction in quality of life. When I started going out, I had these pressure bandages all over my body. I had a mask. You could only see my eyes and ears, and it was hot, and I looked strange. It was very tough to get out to the world. It happens to everybody with an injury, right? All of a sudden, you discover all the things you can't do, and you get strange looks. It's an unpleasant thing. But if you don't do it, the long term is going to be much more challenging. And if we get people to go out to the world, yes, they're going to suffer for a while, but eventually it will get better. So I very much tried to convince the Minister of Finance that the right way to give more money is to incentivize people to get out to the world. And I failed. Political pressures don't always work for us. But I have now a plan in the drawer, and I just need to wait for another election and somebody else. So I'm impatient, but I also think that good science and reasoning will prevail. I don't know much about the British civil service. I mean, I listen to Yes Minister, and I know the basics. But what I was so impressed with that series, and also David, when we met Gus O'Donnell, is that the civil servants in that show, and I think in reality, have more patience than the politicians. And I think scientists need to be like this as well. So we need to say, okay, at the end of the day, what policy will be accepted is also a question of political mood and who exactly is there. But we can do our work and be ready for that time.
Now, I want to put some of the audience questions to you that are coming in on Slido. And if people want to put them in, then it's D265 is this particular event to see some of these. So could we have the Slido questions up?
Now it's what's this fat guy doing on the stage?
Yeah, we've deleted all of those, actually, which I'm hoping. If we could have the Slido questions up. I'll ask you another question in the meantime, which is that I noticed that you said near the beginning you wish that people would put a bit more thought into the wording they use, say, in texts for appointments. It was when you were talking about doctor's appointments, and that even for those text prompts, they should put some more thought into it. But then wouldn't they rely on their own intuition and get it wrong if they did do that? Because we're not always right, are we, about what happens?
So there's a way to get it wrong, but I don't think they could do worse than what they've done originally. So, I think that in many cases, you can't get it in the best way. Like, there's lots of intuitions about, should we use social proof? Should we use financial incentives? But the thing that we saw was that we couldn't get worse than what they did. So do I think that people who have not read anything about social science could get the right approach just by intuition? No. But that level was so functional. It had nothing motivating. So I think that
anything
it's hard
would be
for
better
me.
than nothing. Fair enough. So we've got lots of questions. I like this one. What is the most effective intervention that you've found to work in most of the experiments you've tried?
So it's an easy question in some sense because forcing people to do things is the easiest. I'll give you an example. We created an app that is a Tamagotchi. It's like a turtle. And we give it to patients. And the turtle is happy as long as people exercise, take their medications, and eat well. And the turtle becomes less and less happy as people don't. We tested this turtle, and it has a very small effect. It doesn't do much. People care, but not care that much. So then we gave our turtle superpowers. And we gave the turtle the ability to delete other apps from the phone. So this is angry turtle. As the turtle becomes angrier, apps disappear from the phone, and the first apps that go are the things that people use most frequently. They come back every night, and you get to lose them again every day. We give this to people who had heart surgery. And we say, look, right now, you think to yourself that you'll exercise, eat well, and take your medication, but we know that in 3 weeks that will stop. So let us install this app on your phone. You could never delete our app, but it will force you to behave better. And most people take this on. It really helps because it's such a severe heart condition. We can actually measure death, mortality rate. So these things are on the scale of where do we stand morally on paternalism. It's a very tough place to be, but very effective.
Now, here's an interesting one. Instead of trying to nudge individuals to do things, have you ever tried to nudge politicians or governments to do their job well and to focus on the welfare of everybody?
So I feel a little bit bad that we're recording this, right? So
it will be online, yes.
So one of the things I've learned by working with politicians is that there's lots of, it's not oiling the system in some way, right? So we know, for example, that people love their own ideas, right? People love their own ideas. We have lots of research on that. In one piece of research, we gave people 50 words, and we say, use those 50 words to come up with an idea to solve world hunger. And people come with the same idea because we gave them the words. There's not really that many options. But the moment they go through this exercise, they think the idea is amazing. It's more likely to work. People should volunteer. They're willing to give more money to it. People are people. The process by which we socialize what we're doing and the process by which we attributed credit. I think it's one of those things that, I'm new to this relatively to the BAT group. But I find that a lot of what we do is like that. I'll give you one story as an example. The Ministry of Finance asked us to find out how to figure out pensions for people in the military. Right? People in the military used to retire at an early age because military people used to run, and at 42 they would retire. They still can retire at 42, but now their longevity is much higher. Pensions are very expensive. So we did a little online survey, like that we will all do, right? What would you prefer, $100 more now or $20 more every month, and so on. We put the study online, and we get a few hundred responses from people in the military, and 5 minutes later, the military shuts us down. There's a text message that goes to everybody, says, don't respond to this. Okay, what do? We buy iPads, and we go on just before the weekend to different train stations and restaurants and places where soldiers hang out, and we collect data, and we say, we're not going to be online. It will take them longer to shut us down. And indeed, it took them longer to shut us down. We got a few thousand responses. Then we get a call from the head of the military. saying we need to talk. So we have coffee, and a lot of the topic had to do with creating trust. He says, what are you doing? You're testing something about me. I said, look, I'm just here to help. Let me help you. I mean, you want help, I want to help. Let's work together. This was about 3 months ago, and I find that I spend a lot of my time on trust building. It's very tough, and we've actually created this situation. Actually, I would be interested in this discussion at some point. We're a non-government entity. We're a private company. And I find that we are able to do things across government branches that we couldn't do if we were in the government. So this branch of the government gives us things, and this is sometimes they're not willing for us to share the information across government branches, but they all trust us. But the process of creating trust and willingness is unbelievably complex, and certainly a big part of what we need to do. So how do we do that? How do we create reputation, and how do we socialize ideas? All of those things are incredibly important. What kind of pilots can we do to get people to buy in? One of the things we find works really well is go into a government office, and a government office that kind of questions whether you're going to do something and it's going to work, and change the prices in the cafeteria for a week, and show them how many more people show up or don't show up, and now they'll be convinced that small tweaks really work, right? You offer free coffee, all of a sudden people show up. Now you have a good starting point.
And here's another question. How do you take into account the ethics in your studies? What kind of ethical screening do you do of what you're doing?
Yeah, that's very tough. You know, I've been studying ethics for a long time, dishonesty, and I know that when we have a conflict of interest, we're going to see the world through these conflicts of interest. The only thing we do is we have serious discussion about this. We try to do a cost-benefit analysis of, let's be clear about how many people this would help, how many people not. We also created a calculator for ourselves about what level of paternalism do we feel comfortable with. So, for example, in situations where we feel that there's more symmetry of information in the marketplace, physicians versus patients. In the situations where we think people don't have a chance to learn themselves, like if you think about the turtle story, if you get a second heart attack, I mean, there's no much opportunity for learning. So we actually try to create a rigorous process of saying, what is the level of, under what conditions would be willing to be paternalistic? And then on the other side, we try to be very clear about the cost of benefit. How many people would suffer? How many people would benefit? To what degree? It's a discussion that we have to keep on having. There's not going to be a solution, and as we move forward, it will become more and more difficult to figure out. There's some low-hanging fruit, there's no question. Like, people owe taxes, they should pay taxes. But there are many, many more complex issues, and there's no other way but having deep discussions about it. There's not going to be simple rules of how to deal with that.
And somebody asked, how do we deal with people being diverse and showing different irrational behavior, particularly in an increasingly polarized world?
Yeah, so that's part of the question of the cost-benefit analysis. And, you know, part of it is simple, like saying, you know, different people react differently to different messages, right? Like in the example of no showing for a medical exam, you say some people care about society, some people care about an individual patient. That's easy. I think the more complex one comes when people have a different ideology about end of life, or people have a very different ideology about vaccination. What do we do there? And that's where the ethics is becoming very complex. Like, to what extent? Here's the thing: the more we study irrationality, the less we respect people's declared opinions, in some sense, right? We're basically all in the business of saying people don't know and don't act in their own best interest. It's a very difficult moral position to put ourselves in, but ignoring this data and saying, oh, people know, is also morally very dubious, actually even more morally dubious. So I think we need to remember our basic assumption that come from lots of research, And we just need to figure out that we're doing our best.
And one final question before we break. You said you wanted to do more and more ambitious things and bigger things. And one of these questions here, I think, would fit in with that. Someone says, as someone from the Middle East, do you think it's possible that you could try to use this type of work to try to reduce violence, to try to do something really big?
I think so. So first of all, on a personal level, I go to, every time I get invited to visit a Muslim country, I go. And not too long ago, I've been to Saudi Arabia a few times. I was there a couple of months ago. And it was kind of an amazing, as an Israeli Jewish guy, I gave a 1 day of public talks, 1 day of talking with people in the government. And it was kind of heartwarming to see such reception, right? To think that I can be in Saudi Arabia and talk about work with the Israeli government, tell Jewish jokes. After that, take selfies with women with burqas, and feel that we're all there to understand human nature, that our fallibility is similar, that some of our challenges are similar. There's lots to share. So I think that science, behavioral economics, changing society, all of those things are potentially a really important glue. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, I do think the question is about violence. There's lots of very interesting pockets of lack of violence and living together and having joint incentives. And I do think that we could make progress. Sadly, I think the political will makes it very hard. But I do think I'm optimistic in general, but there's also some specific examples that make me extra hopeful.
Oh, good. Extra hopeful. We like that. We like hope. Well, thank you very much. This has been amazing hearing your talk and for your answers to your questions as well. Thank you for your questions. Dan will be signing books out there, so do head out to look at his books. They're absolutely fantastic. We are breaking for coffee until 10:45, and then you move to parallel sessions again like yesterday, except that this time there are 2 parallel sessions before lunch, and lunch is at 1:15 today. Those of you who I don't see in the individual sessions, I will see later on today when we all come back together. Thank you very much to everybody, and particularly thank you very much, Dan.